If this story touched your heart and you love animals, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Spring 2023 had arrived dry and tense in southwest Texas, in Val Verde County. The air carried dust from the low hills, and the sun, though not yet scorching, held a kind of warning heat. The conflict had begun weeks earlier, a sudden eruption of violence near the border, where an armed group had taken over a stretch of farmland and vanished into the canyons. The military response had been swift but chaotic. Villages were emptied. The roads grew silent. Between the canyon walls and the dry riverbed, a temporary checkpoint was set up, part fence, part fatigue. The soldiers who patrolled it moved without urgency, their boots too heavy with dust and repetition. Sergeant Chris Donovan was on his third week at the outpost. He was 29, tall, quiet, and no longer interested in reasons. The days were made of orders, heat, and dust. His rifle was always clean, his boots always laced, his eyes always moving. During a routine sweep along the northern perimeter, his unit came across a small settlement, nothing more than 3 buildings and the skeleton of a windmill. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but the signs of violence were fresh. Bullet holes in the door frames. A roof scorched into collapse. A well, once used for cattle, now dry and cracked open. They moved cautiously, rifles raised, each soldier checking windows, corners, shadows. The silence was complete, almost staged. No birds, no insects. Only the wind tapping gently on tin. Chris approached the barn last. The door was partially off its hinges, sagging. As he stepped inside, his boot brushed against a spent casing. He raised his rifle again, and then he saw it. Movement. Not fast, not threatening. Just a slow, trembling shift in the far corner beneath a collapsed beam and a pile of broken sacks. He froze. Lowered the rifle just slightly. There, partially obscured by dust and shadow, was a dog. Large, gray, coated in blood and dried mud. Her side rose and fell unevenly, a wet, rattling breath shaking through her. The right side of her chest was torn open, not fresh, but not old either. She didn't try to run, didn't growl. Her head was lifted just enough to see him, and she watched. Not afraid, not welcoming, just there, as if trying to remember what humans were for. Chris didn't call for a medic, didn't call anything at all. He just stood, staring at her, the rest of the world suddenly hushed around them. She didn't blink. Neither did he. Something passed between them, not understanding, not decision, just acknowledgement. Then his boots shifted in the dirt. The dog exhaled once, long and thin, like the sound of something that had almost given up. The order was clear. Leave the animal. That's what the commander said, without hesitation. The medics glanced over at the wounded dog and offered no alternative. Too much blood loss. Internal injuries likely. Infection already spreading. No chance of survival, they said. Just another casualty of a place where nothing stayed untouched for long. But Chris didn't move right away. He crouched down beside her, knees pressing into the dirt floor of the barn, and listened. The dog wasn't whining. She wasn't even looking at him now. Her breaths were slow and raw, pulled from a place just beneath survival. Each inhale scraped like something torn, but they were still coming. He slid his rifle behind his back and reached forward, his arms looping under her body. She didn't resist, didn't flinch, just hung in his grasp like a sack of bones, weightless and too warm in all the wrong places. Blood had crusted along her chest and belly. He could feel every rib through the grime. She weighed almost nothing, and yet she felt heavy in a way he couldn't explain. He carried her past the checkpoint, past the quiet looks of other soldiers who didn't ask. Carried her as the sun sank behind the ridge and shadows stretched across the outpost like questions. When he reached the barracks, the response was instant. No animals. Not here. Not now. Infections. Contamination. Risks. He didn't argue, just nodded once, turned, and kept walking. At the edge of the camp stood an old trench bunker, half collapsed, mostly forgotten. Nearby, a group of soldiers had built a fire pit out of bricks and scrap metal. It burned low every night, mostly for warmth, sometimes for stories. Tonight, it was just embers. Chris laid the dog down beside it, wrapped her in his poncho, tucking it close around her legs and chest. She didn't move. He poured water into the lid of his canteen and held it near her muzzle. Her nose twitched, but she didn't drink. He sat cross-legged beside her, helmet off, the firelight flickering across the dirt on his face. He didn't know why he stayed. He wasn't trying to save her. Not really. He just couldn't leave. Not after she looked at him. Not after the weight of her had filled his arms like something ancient and fragile. So he stayed. Not to fix. Not to hope. Just to be there. The stars came out slow. The fire cracked and whispered in the dark. The dog's breathing was still uneven, still shallow, but it hadn't stopped. That was all that mattered now. That and the sound of her chest rising beside the warmth. The night moved like smoke, slow, silent, full of breath held too long. Wind stirred the ash across the dry soil, lifting fine trails into the darkness and drawing them into the folds of the surrounding hills. Chris didn't sleep. He sat with his back against the crumbling wall of the old bunker, boots planted firm in the dirt, his eyes never straying far from the shape curled in his poncho near the embers. Every 20 minutes, sometimes less, he leaned forward and pressed 2 fingers gently to her neck. There was still a pulse, thin, erratic. But there. He didn't know her name, didn't know where she came from. But something in her silence felt older than the war around them. Something in the way she breathed, shallow yet unbroken, held on to something deeper than instinct. As dawn began to rise, pale and cold across the horizon, her eyelids twitched, then opened. Her eyes were yellow, not bright, not wild, muted like the haze of smoke at sunset. The edges were soft, cloudy, rimmed in gray. She didn't move beyond that. Just looked, not at him, but toward him, like memory passing through a window that wouldn't quite open. Chris exhaled slowly. Around them, the camp began to shift. Boots crunching, voices low, generators coughing to life. Someone dropped off a tin of canned dog food near the bunker. No one said anything. No one had to. He heated it over the fire, letting the scent rise, then crouched beside her again and placed the lid close. She didn't move. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, her nose twitched. Her tongue slipped out, dry and slow, and touched the food. Just once. Then again. It wasn't hunger. It was something older, survival flickering like a pilot light. She didn't sit up. Didn't try to rise. But beneath her paw, one toe twitched, barely more than a flinch. But it was there. A sign. A thread. Chris sat back, shoulders stiff, jaw tight. He watched her without speaking, letting the firelight cast shadows between them. After a while, he said a name. Not loud, not directed, just a breath of sound into the air between heartbeats. Freya. He didn't know why. It didn't mean anything, but it was something to give her, something real. Because if she was going to keep breathing, she deserved more than pain and ash. She deserved a name, a thread to follow back. 4 days had passed. Freya still didn't stand, but she turned her head now. She tracked movement, followed the sound of footsteps with her eyes. When Chris brought food, she ate. Not eagerly, not completely, but enough to show she hadn't given up. Her breath had steadied. Her wounds no longer oozed, but they were deep, ragged. Chris cleaned them twice a day, soaking the cloth in warm water, wiping away the dried blood and dust. He worked slowly, methodically, muttering things under his breath not for her to hear, but just to keep the silence from swallowing them both. Someone from the supply tent dragged over an old mattress. It was torn on one side and stained, but soft enough to matter. Chris laid it beside the fire pit and, with care, shifted Freya onto it. She didn't resist. Her body still trembled sometimes from the pain, but she no longer flinched from his touch. The fire never went out now. It became a marker, a kind of signal that something lived here still. At night, other soldiers stopped by, not to speak, not to question. They just stood for a minute, maybe two, then walked away. Sometimes they nodded, sometimes they didn't, but their silence held something heavy, respect, maybe, or wonder. Freya began to dream. At first, it was just a twitch in her leg, a soft jerk, then stillness. But the second night, her whole body tensed. Her limbs moved as if running, trapped under the weight of memory. Then came the sound, a sharp cry, short and broken, like breath caught in barbed wire. Her mouth opened but didn't bark. Only a hoarse whimper escaped. Chris knelt beside her without thinking. He placed his palm gently against her forehead, feeling the warmth radiate from her skin. She didn't wake. Her body still moved in the grip of some invisible chase. He stroked her head, murmuring something low and steady, words that held no meaning but carried rhythm, something to ground her in the now. Gradually, her movement slowed. The tension left her shoulders. Her breathing fell back into rhythm. She exhaled once, long and rough, and went still again. The pain didn't leave her. Not really. It lived inside, buried deep, like shrapnel too close to the heart to cut free. But she wasn't alone anymore. There was a presence now, not just the fire, not just the food, but a person, a constant. Someone who didn't demand anything, didn't walk away when it got hard. Chris stayed. He didn't understand all the reasons, didn't try to. For months, every action had come from orders, routines, duties printed on paper or drilled into muscle memory. But this was different. No one told him to stay. No one expected it. And still, he did. Not because he had to, but because he couldn't imagine doing anything else. 2 weeks had passed. The mornings were warmer now, the dust finer, the air still laced with the low echoes of conflict somewhere beyond the hills. And one morning, without warning, Freya stood. It wasn't graceful. Her hind legs trembled. One paw barely touched the ground. Chris turned just in time to catch her before she tipped. But she didn't fall. Her body swayed, then stilled. She looked ahead, not at him, and took a step. Then another. The motion was shaky, stiff, but it was motion. After that, everything changed. Each day, Chris walked her beyond the perimeter of the camp, away from the hard-packed dirt and sharp rocks, to a patch of grass and softer soil near the dried creek bed. Freya moved carefully, always on 3 legs, but she moved. Sometimes she followed behind him, nose down, ears alert. Sometimes she walked beside him, head high, eyes scanning the horizon. He never used a leash. He didn't have to. He taught her to sit. Not as a command, not as a trick, but as a grounding. A moment to pause, to be still and safe. He would kneel across from her, place his hand gently under her jaw, and guide her down. She resisted at first, not out of fear, but confusion. Sitting meant stopping, and stopping meant vulnerability. But over time, she accepted it. Sitting became a sign, a choice. She was no longer running from pain. She was choosing to rest. The camp changed, too. At first, soldiers had kept their distance. War made people wary of softness. But Freya stopped flinching when boots passed close. She didn't startle at the crack of distant gunfire or the mechanical clatter of supply trucks. She watched, ears flicking, tail still, body calm. She understood now what was threat and what was noise. One day, she crossed the center of the camp alone. No signal, no hesitation. She walked past rows of tents and stopped near the fire pit, where 2 soldiers were eating in silence. She lay down on the warm dirt, not looking at them, not asking anything, just present, as if saying, "I exist here now, I'm not afraid. And slowly, the camp accepted her. They didn't pet her, didn't feed her, but they nodded when they passed. And Freya began to guard them, not with teeth, not with bark, but with presence. She would sit near the entrance as dusk fell, her body still as stone, ears tuned to the wind. She didn't pace, didn't patrol. She simply watched, until Chris returned. Only then did she move. She would rise and walk to him, slowly, deliberately, as if her day ended when his did. She never entered the tent before him, never curled by the fire unless he was there, as if something tethered her, not by duty, but by choice. She had found her place, and it wasn't inside the wire, not by the medical cot or the storage crates. Her place was beside him, always just outside the line, waiting, not to be called, but to be seen. The mission ended with the heat still clinging to the ground like memory. The unit packed up in silence. The dust of too many nights lingered on their boots. When orders came through that Sergeant Chris Donovan was cleared for leave, no one argued. He stood still for a long moment after reading them, not because of the war, but because he didn't know where to go. With her. The decision didn't come easy, but he made it. He bought an old pickup from a local mechanic near the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just enough space in the back to build a platform, line it with foam and wool blankets. A place to rest, a place to bring someone home. Freya climbed in without command. Her body moved stiffly, but with resolve. She settled on the blanket beside him, head low, ears barely twitching with each gust of dry wind. She didn't watch the road. She didn't flinch at traffic or sound. She simply drowsed, her presence quiet, unshaken. The hum of the tires and the long stretch of highway wrapped around them like silence that healed rather than weighed. The mountains of Colorado rose slow on the horizon. The trees thickened, air thinned. When they reached the driveway near Glenwood Springs, Chris turned off the ignition and sat still. The house stood simple. 2 stories, chipped white paint, porch light glowing in early dusk. His father stepped out first. Didn't speak, just gave a nod. Then turned and opened the door. His mother appeared next, carrying a metal bowl filled with water. She placed it down by the steps and gave a quiet smile. Freya didn't hesitate. She walked forward slowly, ears tilted forward. She didn't sniff corners or skulk along walls. She didn't look for exits. She crossed the threshold and lay down beside the front steps as if she had always known the shape of this place. That night, Chris sat on the edge of his childhood bed, boots still dusty, hands unmoving. Freya padded in quietly, her steps almost soundless on the wooden floor. She paused near the doorway, watching, then moved forward, not to the corner, not to the door, but to the side of the bed. She curled in a loose circle, her back touching the frame, her eyes closed without fear. Her breath deepened, long and slow. Chris lay down without turning the light off. He watched the ceiling, listened. In the middle of the night, when dreams blurred into memory, and memory into grief, he woke. His heart still beat too fast, but he didn't reach for his weapon. He reached down and found her there, warm, breathing, alive. She didn't lift her head, but her tail gave one soft thump against the floorboards. He didn't need words. The war hadn't taken everything. Something had made it back. Not just her body, not just her will, but her trust, her presence. She hadn't returned from a battlefield. She had returned to something else, to life.